In June 1941, Germany launched its invasion of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, the largest ever land invasion in history, gaining huge swathes of territory in mere months by the end of the year. 3 years later, by summer 1944, the situation had drastically changed. The ultimate failure of the German invasion was clear when the Soviet Red Army launched Operation Bagration, which decimated Germany's army, the Wehrmacht, opening up the route for invasion of Germany's own territory. The Battle of Berlin and the fall of the Third Reich in May 1945. Germany's failure has often been ascribed to the claims that the German Wehrmacht was vastly outnumbered and the freezing cold of Russian winters. But these reasons are a great oversimplification and are misleading. This video will explain the real reasons for the failure of Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. To understand German strategic thinking in summer 1941, the legacy of World War I, which began back in 1914, must be considered. Imperial Germany had been pressured into submission by the British Royal Navy's blockade of the Central Powers. The prevention of imports by sea created severe food shortages, with Germans suffering greatly in the winter of 1916 to 1917, aptly named the Turnip Winter, when much of Germany's population were forced to rely on turnips for sustenance. By autumn 1918, many Germans were malnourished and becoming ever more desperate, with the will of German soldiers to fight being sapped. This contributed to the November Revolution, when the last Kaiser of Germany, Wilhelm II, was forced to abdicate on the 9th of November 1918, followed by the armistice which ended World War I on the 11th of November. This defeat by starvation and collapse of morale haunted Hitler, a fate he was desperate to avoid in World War II. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, the agreement to partition Poland, its western half to Germany and its eastern half to the Soviet Union, went far further than just promising non-aggression, reflecting Hitler's anxieties. Alongside the pact, trade ties between both countries were augmented, enabling close economic cooperation. Germany would export civilian machinery, military technology, and weapons to the Soviets. In return, the Soviets would supply Germany with various raw materials. By 1940, Germany relied on Soviet imports for 34% of its oil, 40% of its nickel, 65% of its chrome, 74% of its phosphate, 67% of its asbestos, and 55% of its manganese. Of utmost importance was the Soviets' agreement in 1940 to send over 1 million metric tons of grain, going some way to make up for the inadequacy of Germany's domestic agriculture. While Soviet materials helped enable Germany's stunning conquest of France, within 6 weeks, the reliability of their provision was tenuous. Each shipment's size became a point of debate, creating unease in the German Foreign Office, who cautioned against over-reliance on the Soviets. The uncertainty interfered with Germany's logistical planning. Of alarming concern was Stalin's successful ultimatum to Romania in June 1940, insisting that Bucharest cede northern Bukovina and Bessarabia to the Soviet Union. Romania was one of Germany's main providers of oil, the foreseeable loss of which could cripple Germany's strength. By the end of 1940, Romania joined Germany's tripartite pact alliance. Soviet Bolshevism had long been framed as the ultimate ideological enemy of Hitler's National Socialism, but this had been put aside due to economic necessity. It was now, as the material advantages of cooperating with the Soviets becoming questionable, that Hitler became convinced that the time to decisively strike against the Soviet Union had come. Hitler contended that Germany must acquire Ukraine so that no one is able to starve us again, as they did in the last war. Hitler's thinking became influenced by Herbert Bach, an agricultural scientist who fixated on Ukraine and southern Russia as the answer to Germany's predicament. He promoted the fertile properties of the black soil in these regions and stated to Hitler that possessing these regions would liberate us from every economic pressure. This perfectly melded into the concept of Lebensraum, as in living space, which Hitler had first published in his 1925 biographical political manifesto, Mein Kampf. Bach's proposal simultaneously answered Hitler's anxieties concerning Imperial Germany's fate in World War I, the current economic logistical issues of World War II, and crucially, the future territorial and demographic expansion of the Third Reich. On the 2nd of May 1940, a meeting of military planners spelled out the specifics of what later became known as Bach's Hunger Plan. From the moment the Wehrmacht set foot on Soviet territory, they were to feed themselves on Soviet produce. Farms in the so-called surplus zone in and around Ukraine were to be colonized with German settlers, with all grain grown sent straight back to Germany or to the army. Those beyond, to the north, in the so-called deficit zone, were characterized as useless eaters, who were to be entirely cut off from sustenance. A report on the 23rd of May further developed the plan. It stated many tens of millions of people in this territory will become superfluous and will die or must emigrate to Siberia, where they would wear down the Soviet resources instead. It further claimed that attempts to rescue the population there from death through starvation can only be at the expense of provisioning Europe. They prevent the possibility of Germany holding out to the end of the war. It was on this calculation that Nazi Germany placed the ultimate success not only of the upcoming Operation Barbarossa, but the whole of the war. Bach's disdain for Russians permeated his hunger plan. He argued that the Russian has endured poverty, hunger, and frugality for centuries. He further stated, "Do not attempt to apply the German standard of living as your yardstick and to alter the Russian way of life. This attitude would have far-reaching consequences during the coming invasion." Operation Barbarossa launched on the 22nd of June 1941. Militarily, it was initially very successful. By the 1st of December, the Wehrmacht was within 20 miles of Moscow, having advanced several hundred kilometers. However, the German advance now stalled. The foremost reason for this was the shortage of oil and therefore of fuel. It is approximated that the German force advancing on Moscow ideally needed 27 fuel deliveries a month. In November 1941, it only received 3. Likewise, regarding food, the picture blackened. Daily calorie consumption in Germany actually decreased further. Instead of more grain being sent back to Germany, the volume of grain was smaller than what the Soviets had been providing Germany before the invasion began. The Soviet Red Army's scorched earth strategy of either destroying or removing their own food stores as they retreated made it impossible for the German army to implement its plan to live off the land, deteriorating the situation even further. In spring 1942, the harvest in territories that the Germans had conquered were at most only 2/3 of their pre-invasion level. In summer 1942, Hitler aptly recognized the critical danger of the fuel situation and adapted the Wehrmacht strategy. Operation Blue launched, plunging through southern Russia to seize the vital oil fields of the Caucasus. Hitler had stated, "If I do not get the oil of Maykop and Grozny, then I must end the war." Where Hitler's thinking was less lucid was his over-determination to capture Stalingrad, which diverted scarce fuel and manpower away from the operation's primary goal of capturing oil fields. Stalingrad became a quagmire. Hundreds of thousands of Germans were killed in the fighting. By the end of 1942, 250,000 men, under the command of Friedrich Paulus, became surrounded in the city. On the 31st of January 1943, the following year, Paulus surrendered to the Soviets. Only around 91,000 men survived to the point of surrender. The defeat was a fatal blow to the Wehrmacht, not only in terms of casualties, but also in a failure to secure oil, which worsened fuel shortages going forwards. A cliché explanation for the German defeat at Stalingrad is that they were simply defeated by hordes of Red Army soldiers, using sheer manpower, but this does not stand up to scrutiny. Germany's Axis allies, Hungary, Italy, and Romania, all contributed over 100,000 men each to Operation Blue. The opposing sides at Stalingrad each had a roughly equal size of around 1 million men. It was superior Soviet strategy and tactics which brought about their victory. Soviet planners successfully identified the weakness of the Romanian units guarding Stalingrad's flanks, who lacked armor and anti-tank weaponry. The Soviet Operation Uranus swept through these Romanian forces, trapping the German 6th Army inside Stalingrad. This defeat was down to the Germans neglecting the defense of their own flanks, not Soviet human wave tactics, which is often alleged. While Germany's food and supply problems became more exacerbated, the Soviet situation was improving. From Britain and the United States, military equipment was imported. Of particular importance was the US's deliveries of large quantities of food. These reached the Soviet Union via the Persian Corridor, Russia's Far East, and most famously, the highly dangerous Arctic convoys to Russia's northern coast, despite the efforts of German U-boats to stop them. This meant the bulk of the bad repercussions of the hunger plan began to fall more heavily not on the Soviets, but instead on the Germans, who had less recourse to importing food from elsewhere once the plan's failure became clearer. Bach's hunger plan ultimately backfired due to its unrealistic expectations and its repercussions. In addition to failing to improve Germany's domestic food supply, it also undermined the military campaign by alienating potential collaborators and allies. Upon entering Ukraine, the Wehrmacht were at first welcomed as liberators, with the Organization for Ukrainian Nationalists proclaiming Ukrainian independence on the day that the Germans marched into Lviv. However, this organization was speedily repressed, and its members interned into concentration camps. This changed the nature of Ukrainian relations with the Germans, from one mostly predicated on cooperation to a greater focus on violent resistance. Had the German approach to Eastern Europe and Russia been based on pragmatism, not the hunger plan, the Germans would have been able to far more effectively exploit anti-Soviet sentiment to bolster its manpower and economic resources to potentially outmatch the Red Army in the long term. In the event, the Germans' recruitment of 600,000 Huey fighters from Eastern Europe was far below its potential had the hunger plan not initially been followed. Even committed Nazi Alfred Rosenberg recognized the shortcomings of the hunger plan's assumptions. As a Baltic German, Rosenberg vigorously hated communism and perceived the role of the Germans to be liberators of those oppressed by Stalinism. To this end, Rosenberg promoted the need to create at least nominally independent anti-communist states and argued that the conquered territory as a whole must not be treated as the object of exploitation. Hitler dismissed his warnings and viewed the Ukrainians as Slavs, just like the Russians, to be treated with disdain, echoing Bach's prescribed treatment for Slavs. The result was crippling for the longevity of Germany's military campaign. Rosenberg's advisors in February 1944 noted that Germany had, within a year, chased into the woods and swamps, as partisans, a people which was absolutely pro-German and had jubilantly greeted us as their liberator. These partisans would harass German convoys, decreasing the effectiveness of already greatly strained German supply lines, crippling the German military machine, contributing to major military defeats. Following the defeat at Stalingrad, Germany's last chance to regain the initiative was at the Battle of Kursk in Ukraine. It was the largest tank battle in history. The Soviets emerged victorious despite their T-34 medium tanks being technically inferior to the German panzers due to superior Soviet planning. Kursk was Germany's last major offensive against the Soviet Union, following which they were pushed onto the defensive on the Eastern Front for the rest of the war. In January 1944, a Soviet counterattack ended the German siege of Leningrad, which had been in place since September 1941. During the siege, the Soviet defenders had to withstand freezing temperatures and during winters had to rely on the so-called Road of Life over the frozen lake Ladoga. The siege had demonstrated that not only the Germans suffered from the Russian winter, it could hamper the Red Army too. Therefore, the Russian winter on its own can't explain Germany's defeats. By summer 1944, the Red Army's Operation Bagration shattered Germany's front line, opening the way for the Soviets to invade Germany's own territory and fight in the Battle of Berlin, ending the Third Reich's existence by May 1945. Ultimately, the two key factors in the failure of Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union were not a numerical superiority of the Red Army or the Russian winter. In reality, the decisive factors were Germany's shortage of oil and therefore fuel, which inhibited motorized combat, and Herbert Bach's ill-thought-out ideas with his hunger plan. The hunger plan promised unrealistic amounts of supplies and food, which prevented realistic assessment by German military planners, and also alienated anti-communist inhabitants of Eastern Europe, who otherwise could have been used for the war effort to a greater extent. On top of these was the Allied material support from Britain and the United States for the Soviet Union, as well as the superior strategic and tactical decisions of the Red Army after their initial setbacks, which enabled them to both outgun and outmaneuver the German forces, even when facing Axis forces of equivalent manpower, such as at Stalingrad. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.